Okay, so my name's Dallin Herzog, and this is AMP2, Anatomy and Physiology 2. And we're going to start with chapter 14, and we're just going to do kind of a little summary. And if there are comments or questions, feel free to ask or say something, I guess, unless that's not appropriate. So when we talk about blood, blood is a kind of connective tissue. And so in the last term, when you guys talked about anatomy, one of the things you talked about were types of tissues, and we talked about epithelial tissues and connective tissues and nervous tissue and muscle tissue. So those are the 4 tissue categories. Well, this falls under the category of connective tissue for a couple reasons. One reason is because it connects our body all to different parts, and one other reason is because it has more extracellular matrix than it has cells. And so when you think about blood is mostly made up of water. So that more than half of blood is just water, and that's its extracellular matrix. And then there's stuff in the water, suspended in the water, like proteins and cells and things like that. And of course, we're going to talk more about those things in a minute. So this is, when you think about connective tissues, it's kind of weird because we have different types, and this is one type of connective tissue. So what is blood for? So blood is important for a couple reasons. Of course, one of the main reasons why we need blood is because we need oxygen. So all the cells in our body have to have oxygen to do cellular respiration, and the result of that is to make ATP, and so the ATP gives us energy to be able to move and breathe and digest and stuff like that. So you have to have that ATP. So in order to do that, we need oxygen, which is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. And so then we use that ATP for that. Oxygen to make ATP. Blood also allows us to get rid of waste products. So one of the main waste products that our cells produce when we make ATP, again, making ATP is really, really important. But one of the byproducts of that is carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide is a waste product that comes primarily from the citric acid cycle. And so we have to get that out of our body. If that builds up too much, it becomes acid, among other things, and it will change our pH, which will cause lots of problems if your pH gets too low. So then we do things to get rid of it, and so the blood helps do that. Blood also helps with temperature regulation. It also helps transport immune system stuff throughout the body to fight off infections. It helps a lot with lubrication. It helps with lots of other things. So blood's really, really important. When we talk about blood has 2 main components. It has the plasma, which is the watery part, and then it has what are called formed elements. So the formed elements are going to be red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So these are cells, red blood cells, white blood cells. We kind of talked about some of these a little bit already, but we'll talk more about those in a minute. And then platelets are not cells, but they're pieces of a cell called a megakaryocyte. And they break off of that cell, and then they go and they stick together and help prevent us from getting from bleeding to death, make the blood clot. So red blood cells transport oxygen, white blood cells fight off infections, and then platelets help prevent and stop bleeding. So that's the formed elements. So if we look at this little diagram here, it shows blood. So it's made up of formed elements, which are platelets, red blood cells, white blood cells. So we established that. And then the plasma. So the plasma is mostly water. 92% of the plasma is water. 55% of blood is plasma. So the main part of blood is water. So that's super important. So water, and then you have electrolytes, sodium, potassium, chloride ions, things like that. Water, we said that. Proteins, we're going to have albumins that are going to help maintain the osmotic gradient of the blood. We have globulins that help fight off infections, like immunoglobulins, like antibodies, and then fibrinogen, which helps with blood clotting and repairing damaged blood vessels. And then wastes like nitrogen wastes, carbon dioxide, and then nutrients like transporting carbohydrates, vitamins, and proteins, and things like that. And then gases as well. So you can kind of see a little summary. You maybe don't need to memorize these. I'm not sure if that's important or not, but to understand like the basic idea of this is really important. So if you understand the blood's made up of formed elements and plasma, the basic things that formed elements are, the basic thing that plasma is, those things are really important. we'll talk a little bit about this stuff in this chapter, but later on in the book, there's a whole chapter on the immune system. And so then we'll go into way more detail in that when we get to that chapter. But right now, we'll just kind of touch on it. Okay, so when we talk about the formed elements, one of the main parts of formed elements are the platelets. So platelets are going to help fight off infections. So, and the formed elements also have white blood cells and red blood cells. So the process of making blood cells is called hematopoiesis. So all blood cells come from the bone marrow. Now the bone marrow has stem cells inside of it that are the origin of these cells that make up our formed elements. And there's signals that the body will send to the stem cells so that they could turn into white blood cells, or they could turn into red blood cells, or whatever, depending on what our bodies need. And so the main signal that stimulates red blood cell production is called, I forgot what it's called, just slipped my mind. It's called, I don't know, we'll see it in a second. But there are different signals. So there are signals that stimulate the white blood cells and red blood cells. So once our body gets a need, so if our red blood cell production goes down or oxygen levels go down, then the body will release these products that will then increase whatever it is that we need. So we have our stem cells in the bone marrow, and then we have myeloid stem cells that will turn into erythroblasts that will become erythrocytes, megakaryocytes, which then produce platelets. We have the myeloblasts that make the phils, the basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils. And then we have the lymphoid stem cells that are going to turn into our white blood cells, or T cells, or B cells, and monoblasts, which make our monocytes. And those become macrophages. And so, again, like, you probably don't need to memorize like these specific steps of these cells, but to understand the fact that all of them come from this origin, or this precursor cell, is really important. And so the body sends a signal here, and it can become red blood cells, or you can make more neutrophils, or you can make more T cells, or whatever your body needs for, you know, whatever the situation is that's going on. Right. So when we talk about formed elements, one type of formed element is a red blood cell. They're also called erythrocytes. So erythro means red, cyte means cell, and so they're red cells. They're red because inside the cytoplasm of the red blood cell, there's an iron-containing compound called hemoglobin, and when it binds to oxygen, it turns red. And so when you think of that, it's just like rust or something like that. It has a red pigment because it's oxidizing. But red blood cells are designed specifically to do one thing, and one thing only. They're designed to transport oxygen. They're basically like a dump truck for oxygen, or like a bus or Uber or whatever for oxygen. And so as the red blood cells grow and they mature, once they become an adult red blood cell, they kick out their nuclei and they kick out most of their internal organelles. And so what that does is that gives more space inside the cytoplasm for hemoglobin, for these transporting or oxygen binding molecules, so it can transport more oxygen. And so that's really important. One of the other things that's really important about this is that the shape of a red blood cell is shaped in such a configuration that it increases the surface area so that it can maximize the amount of oxygen that can diffuse into the red blood cell when it goes through the capillaries around the lungs. And then when it gets in the capillaries in our periphery, in our feet, hands, and brain, or wherever, then it maximizes the surface area so more oxygen can diffuse out of the red blood cell. And so this is really cool. When you think about this, the whole process of this red blood cell transporting oxygen is just a fascinating thing, because it has to have a strong enough connection to hemoglobin to pick it up from the lungs, but it has to have a weak enough connection to the hemoglobin that it can dump it into the body. And so there has to be a way for it to move this back and forth, and so it's a pretty neat process, so we'll talk more about that in a second. So the idea that it doesn't have any nuclei or mitochondria inside the cytoplasm is really important. But one of the bad side effects of that is that if it doesn't have a nucleus, then once it starts to get old, it starts to break down, it can't fix its problems. Because the nucleus is where, of course, you contain the information that's necessary for it to repair itself. And so once it starts getting old, the red blood cells will just die and your body recycles them. So adult red blood cells don't have a very long life cycle, which is one of the reasons why we constantly have to make more red blood cells every single day. And so especially if you're bleeding or something like that, then you have to make even more to compensate for it. So adult red blood cells don't live very long, and there are special little areas in our body that recognize these cells as they start to get old, and your body will just rip them apart, destroy them, and recycle the iron and some of the other components, so you make more red blood cells really efficiently. So our body's really good at making more red blood cells, and that's really important because we need them a lot. So we have to have, like we said before, we have to have that oxygen to make ATP, especially when you think of things like brain function. So brain function requires a lot of ATP because we have to get those neurons working, heart functions and things like that. So if you look at these pictures, this is a histology slide that shows red blood cells. This is a diagram, but you can see it curves in on both sides. And so that, as it goes through the capillaries, most capillaries have the same diameter as the outer diameter of the inner diameter of the capillary has the same diameter as the outer diameter of the red blood cell. And so as they move through, their surface area is going right along the surface of the capillary. There's one layer of epithelial tissue of the alveoli of the lungs, one layer of epithelial tissue of the capillary, and then bam, it's going right into the cell. So super thin. And then in the appendages and in our periphery, then there's just the red blood cell, and it just diffuses out of the red blood cell into the tissues because it could just go straight across those epithelial layers. And so the red blood cells are designed very specifically to do certain things. And so this is just like the rest of our body. There's no randomness to how the body's set up. Every single part of your body is put together in very specific ways to carry out a very specific function. And of course, we can see that really well here in the red blood cell that is designed to transport oxygen. So as we mentioned before, all of the blood cells in our body come from stem cells in the bone marrow. And they're going to receive different signals that will trigger them to turn into different things. So the main stimulus that's going to cause red blood cell production is called erythropoietin. And erythropoietin, or EPO, is a signal that comes from the kidneys when oxygen levels, primarily from the kidneys, when oxygen levels in your body are low. And so this little flow chart kind of shows how this works. When oxygen levels go down, the kidneys and somewhat from the liver, they release this signal into the bloodstream, which goes to the bone marrow. It stimulates the hematopoietic stem cells to turn into red blood cells. And then as you make more red blood cells, then of course you're transporting more oxygen, which then turns this off. So it's a negative feedback loop that just helps regulate the level of red blood cells in your body. So kind of an interesting side note is that because people have kind of figured out how this works, then people can manipulate the system. And of course there are medicinal reasons for this. People that have anemia or chronic, problems where they don't make enough red blood cells, then they can take a medicinal form of erythropoietin, and then they can make this help their body. In some cases though, you also can do this inappropriately. And so you hear about athletes a lot of times that will take medicines, or they'll take steroids or some kind of things in their body that will artificially increase their red blood cell production. So if you are an athlete and you take erythropoietin, you can actually make your red blood cell production go up. And it's one way that you can increase your red blood cell production. You can artificially make yourself more, more powerful or more strong or whatever, make you a better athlete. And so it's not legal, but so don't do that unless you.
Does higher elevation do the same?
Yeah, so there's actually a trigger, and the notes go into this a little bit later, but there is a thing that your body will actually compensate. So as you go to higher elevations and the partial pressures of oxygen are lower, then your body actually will compensate and recognize the changes and will eventually adapt to it. So it'll start to produce more red blood cells to compensate for that as well and be more efficient about the way it transports its oxygen. So it's pretty cool, yeah. And so like, that's also true, and that's not illegal. So what a lot of athletes will do is, and maybe this is what you're getting at, but they'll go to like a higher altitude, like here in Salt Lake, for Olympic sports, it's really common for Winter Olympics people to come and they work out at like the Olympic Oval in Kearns. It's like really world famous, and they come here and they work out there. It's a really good facility, but it's also higher altitude. And then when they go and they compete at a lower altitude, their body's now adapted to this more efficient transporting of oxygen, and they go to California or somewhere like that, and then their body works better, and it gives them a competitive advantage. But it's not like taking a drug to make yourself get a competitive advantage. Okay, so we talked about formed elements. Formed elements are red blood cells, we've talked about those, white blood cells, and platelets. So white blood cells, there are two main categories. The two main categories are granulocytes and agranulocytes. So this word, if you break it apart, means cells with grains inside of it. And so at some point, some scientists stained them a certain way, and they look like they have little spots or little grains of sand inside of them. So that's why they're called that. There are three types of granulocytes. There are the phils: neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. And when you look at these, to a certain extent, they're each going to have kind of their own function. In our bodies, when we get certain types of infections or certain types of exposures to diseases, we'll see different things will trigger increases in those kinds of cells. So inflammation in general, especially basophils, they're going to be involved in inflammation mostly. All of them will a little bit, but basophils do a lot. Eosinophils will be involved in inflammation, but they will also be involved especially in parasitic infections. So when people get like an intestinal parasite or something like that, their eosinophil count goes up a lot. And then neutrophils are more general white blood cells that we see that are involved in more like basic infections. Basic, that's probably not the right word, but like bacterial infections and things like that. And so when people get your general bacterial infection, your neutrophil count goes up a lot. So your granulocytes are your neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. And then agranulocyte. So if you put an A on the front, what does that mean?
None.
Not, yeah. So no grains in the cell, basically, is what that means. Again, it's sort of up to interpretation, and it depends on how you stain them and whatever, but that's what it means anyways. So those include the lymphocytes and monocytes. Monocytes become macrophages. Macrophages go and they eat things. They're like Pac-Man. I don't know if you guys know what Pac-Man is. You're probably too young for that.
No, we know him.
I think that's like, it's like my generation. Anyways, the monocytes become macrophages to eat things and kill them. The lymphocytes then are going to be your T cells and your B cells. So this part of the immune system, of course, as we mentioned before, there's a whole chapter on the immune system. We'll break it down really nice and neat, and we'll go through that. But the lymphocytes are special cells that have really specific ways that they interact with foreign antigens, with infectious agents to kill them. And so we'll talk more about that later. But just for now, the basic characteristics of the lymphocytes are that differentiate them from the other parts of the immune system are that they have memory, or they can retain the ability to fight off a certain infection for a long period of time, memory, and they can be very specific. So your body creates very specific T cells and B cells against specific pathogens. So we have specific T cells that fight off polio. We have specific T cells that fight off salmonella, whatever. And then as your body makes them, then you retain that for a long period of time. So the great thing about that is, and we'll talk again more about this later, but the great thing about that is you can intentionally expose yourself to them in a non-lethal or damaging way, and then your body can create immune system stuff through vaccines and whatnot to fight off those infections and help prevent you from getting sick or dying and stuff. And so that's super cool. Okay, so functions of white blood cells. So white blood cells do different things. When we think about white blood cells, basically the idea is that they kill bad guys. So we want our body to be healthy and strong. We don't want infections to kill us and take over our bodies. And so things like inflammation. So a lot of times we think about inflammation as like bad, and a lot of times it is, but there are good things about inflammation. Inflammation increases blood circulation to site of tissue damage. And so blood has oxygen, it has nutrients, it has vitamins, it gets rid of waste products, it has white blood cells, there's all kinds of things in it. And so if we sprain my ankle, or if I get an infection or I cut my arm or something, I need to get blood there because it has all these resources that my body needs to repair whatever the damage is. And so inflammation in certain levels or certain types, certain situations is good. Now, too much inflammation, of course, is really bad, and sometimes the actual inflammation can be even more damaging than what's causing it. And so you have to be really careful. And most of the time when we think about like spraining my ankle, or I think about like pulling a muscle or something like that, I usually try to do stuff to stop inflammation. So, you know, it's there for a reason. When it works the way it's supposed to, it's good, but sometimes it can be bad, and so then I take Advil or I take Tylenol or something like that to stop it. And so that's part of what the immune system does. Phagocytosis, this is really important. So when you have tissue damage or you have an infectious agent, the immune system goes in and it eats the bad guys, or it removes the damaged tissue. And so phagocytosis is a process of engulfing. So that's the Pac-Man actually eating stuff. So macrophages, dendritic cells, those kind of cells, neutrophils, they go in and they can actually eat pathogens, and they can get rid of damaged tissue so that your body can repair stuff. So that's important. Cellular adhesion molecules. So there are different types. One of the main types of cellular adhesion molecule are antibodies. So immunoglobulins or antibodies can go and they can actually stick to the pathogen, and they can, or to other cells in some cases, and that can help them in the immune system get rid of those pathogens. And there's other examples. Chemotaxis, so chemical movement. And so positive chemotaxis, a lot of the white blood cells in our body, when they're involved in an immune response, they will release chemicals that stimulate chemotaxis, or they stimulate the movement of white blood cells to the site of tissue damage. So it's a way to recruit help. It's kind of like calling the police if someone's breaking your house, or calling the fire department if your house catches on fire. It's a way to get that help to come and fix whatever the injury is or whatever the damage is. So chemotaxis is really important. And then diapedesis, this is the process of the white blood cell squeezing out of a blood cell to get to where the tissue damage is. So when you look at this picture, the white blood cells are going to use the same blood vessels that other stuff in our body uses to get from place to place. So it's kind of like driving along the road. So the fire truck gets the signal, oh, there's a fire at Fortis College, I need to get there. So they move along the freeway, they move along the roads, whatever. When they get to Fortis College, they have to get off the road and go into the parking lot. So they squeeze between the cells of the capillaries through a process called diapedesis, and then they get out of the blood cell, and they get to where the actual microorganisms are, and then they can eat them or kill them, do whatever they have to do to fight off the infection. Okay, so those are some of the main things that the cells are going to do. The other one of the formed elements are platelets. So we talked about red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Platelets come from a cell called a megakaryocyte, and they break off. And so these cells are made by our body. And so when you talk about platelets, this process is really, really important, because if you break a blood vessel, or you somehow tear one or whatever, smash it, then the blood's going to start to leak out and it won't get to where it needs to go. So this is can be really serious. So there's steps of blood clotting, and we'll talk more about those. Probably not today. We'll have to see about that. But one of the steps of blood clotting is that platelets will come and help make a temporary plug of whatever the damaged part of the blood vessel is. So the platelets will adhere to each other, and they will adhere to rough surfaces on the inside of a blood vessel, or rough surfaces of a blood vessel, particularly collagen. They're really attracted to that. They'll stick to that, they'll stick to each other, and they can form a temporary plug that will stop bleeding. And so that's really important. The process of stopping bleeding is called hemostasis. And so that helps fix that problem. One of the things about platelets, though, that's really important when you think about this process is that we want platelets to form if we have some kind of damage to a blood vessel, but we don't want them to form otherwise. And just like everything else in our body, if it's working the way it's supposed to, it's great. But if it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, then it's a problem. And that can happen in two ways when you talk about platelets, either too much or too little. Of course, if you get cut and you don't make enough platelets or something, then you can have a problem. And then if you have formed platelets or blood clots when you don't want to, that's also a really serious problem as well.
What are the ways that your body cannot make enough platelets? Like, what's the result of that?
Well, most of the time when people talk about like the inability to clot blood, it's called hemophilia. And so in general, that can be caused by different things. A lot of times it's caused by a clotting factor more than it is by platelets. But if you don't make enough platelets, you kind of get the same result. And of course, if you cut yourself and you don't stop bleeding, then that's really serious, because even just a minor thing that maybe happens to all of us, you scrape your knee or you cut your finger, slice a cheese, or you have a nosebleed, or whatever simple things are that happen to everybody. Like people die from stuff like that, and so it can be really serious. But there are treatments for it. There are ways to fix it. It isn't. It's mostly a genetic, inherited thing. And there's actually some really interesting studies about hemophilia that you can look at. And one of the main ways that people have studied it is through royal families in history. And of course, when you talk about royal families, you see, what do they call it? Not dominant, recessive traits that show up in these families because they interbreed so much. And so there's this really interesting study about one of the families of a Tsar in Russia, and you can follow their genetics because they were so careful about like who married who and like the royalty and stuff. They had to keep track of that kind of stuff because that's what gave them the authority to be in charge. But it also shows these relationships between these interesting genetic traits. And so in this one Tsarist family, a lot of their children died because they inherited this hemophilia thing. And of course, back in the day, 200 or 300 years ago, they didn't have medical treatments we have now.
Yeah.
So pretty scary.
Interesting.
But yeah, anyways, so platelets are important, and so we need that to stop bleeding. So we talk about cutting a blood vessel. The process of preventing ourselves from bleeding when we break a blood vessel is called hemostasis. And there's basically three things that are going to happen. The first thing that happens when you cut a blood vessel is that the smooth muscle of the blood vessel is going to constrict really fast. It's kind of like a reflex. It just constricts really fast. Why would you want that to happen if you cut a blood vessel? Stops
Stop the bleeding.
Right. Yeah, good. So that happens first. And then the platelet plug forms. We talked about that. The platelets will stick to the damaged collagen on the inside of the blood vessel and to each other. They form a plug. And then the other clotting factors come in, and you form like a net of protein, of fibrin and fibrinogen, that then will trap blood cells and platelets and things like that and form kind of like a scab. So these are the three steps of hemostasis. One of the interesting things about this is that this happens super fast, but it doesn't last very long. But the idea is that this has to last long enough for this to happen. So then this happens not as fast, but kind of fast, and it lasts long enough for then this to happen. This takes longer, but it lasts longer. And then once this happens, then hopefully you've created a mesh or a net or a temporary fix over the hole, so the blood vessel then can actually heal. So then the epithelial tissues will divide, and your body will come in and produce more collagen and actually fix the damage. And so this process has to work really well. Platelets in particular, their flow through our blood, and they'll recognize like rough surfaces on blood vessels and stuff, but they also stick together better when there's no circulation. And so that's good and bad. So if you cut this off, then they're going to start sticking together better, which is good. But that's also bad because if you're sedentary for long periods of time, then of course you can get blood clots. That's a bad thing. We don't want that to happen. But then hopefully the way this works is that it allows the blood vessel to heal, and you can fix the problem. So you damage the blood vessel, you get blood vessel spasm. And the platelets come along and they stick to each other and they plug up the hole to stick to the collagen on the inside of the blood vessel to plug it up. And then these yellow little spiderwebby looking things are the fibrinogen that comes together. And the fibrinogen is related to the clotting factors. So the clotting factors come, and there's a series of steps that we skipped. But eventually the last step is that the fibrin is cleaved, is stuck together and forms fibrinogen, which then hooks onto the damaged portions of the blood vessel and forms kind of a net that traps red blood cells and traps white blood cells and platelets and things like that to form a long-term plug. And so that's good and it's important. But, never mind, we haven't covered that. These are the clotting factors. You guys can look at those. The bad thing about it is that sometimes the platelets and the clotting factors stick to things that we don't want them to stick to. So in particular, in people that have really high blood pressure or people that have high cholesterol, high blood pressure can damage the smooth lining on the inside of blood vessels called endothelium. And if that's damaged and those smooth cells break off, then there's rough surfaces that the platelets are going to stick to. Also, if you're very sedentary, platelets will start to stick to each other and they're more likely to stick to the rough surfaces on the inside of your blood vessels. In addition to that, if you have a lot of cholesterol in your blood, the cholesterol is a fatty substance, it's hydrophobic. Blood is mostly water, which is polar. And so fat and water don't mix, oil and water don't mix. And so these fatty substances are going to try to get out of your blood vessel and they'll form clumps and they'll stick to the inside of the blood vessel to try to get out of it. And sometimes they'll sneak underneath the endothelium to try to get out of the blood because they don't like it. But they form these clumps and then platelets start to stick to those, and then that can cause a blood clot, it can cause stenosis, it can cause all kinds of atherosclerosis and things like that. And so these kind of things are really bad. And these are problems that we have when this process of blood clotting doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And so these would be things that you probably would want to learn about maybe in a little more detail. But like an embolism, pulmonary embolism, or thrombus, those kind of things, those are really dangerous, can be really, really serious, life-threatening. So we want to be careful about that. So regular exercise, eating healthy, fruits and vegetables, dealing with stress while you're nursing school so your blood pressure doesn't get too high and you have a heart attack. Those kind of things are really important. So make sure that you have good health, like you go to Pilates classes or, eat your vegetables.
That's why in some surgeries, the first thing that they do after the surgery is like go to walk.
Oh yeah. They also have those little like squishy things.
STDs.
Yeah.
What are they called?
STDs.
STDs? Or those? Yeah.
STDs.
I don't know. So there's the blood transfusion thing. It's pretty important. That's another big item on this lecture. And we could talk about that now or later if you want, whatever you guys want to do.
Yeah, either way works.
Okay. So when you talk about blood transfusions, this is a big deal in real life nowadays. The pharmacies, and there's a lot of checks and balances that people will do, and it's really hard to make a mistake if you're like in a clinic or a hospital or something. But the whole idea and the principle behind it's really important. It's a big thing that nursing students always have to learn about. So the this is related to the antigens that are on the surface of red blood cells. So we talk about our cells or any kind of substance, cells or pollen or bacteria, whatever, viruses, they all have surface features on them that identify them as who they are. So it's kind of like us. Like even though we all have a nose, we have eyes, and we have hair and stuff. I mean, some people don't have hair, but you know what I'm saying? Like we have features that make me unique to everyone else. Fingerprints, the fingerprints on my hands make me unique to everyone else, and same with you guys. And so that's the same with bacteria and viruses and pollen and cells in our body. They all have fingerprints that identify them and make them unique. The reason why this is important is because the whole process of the immune response depends on its ability to recognize good fingerprints from bad fingerprints. So the immune system has to be able to see a cell and say, this is a good guy, I'm not going to kill it. Or see a cell and say, oh, this is a bad guy, I need to get rid of it or it's going to hurt me. And it has to be able to recognize that. And these fingerprints that it recognizes and uses to fight off infections are called antigens. So red blood cells have antigens that identify them. There are antigens that make red blood cells A type. There are red blood cells that make antigens B. There are red blood cells that have both, and there are red blood cells that have neither, which is O. And then there's also another antigen that's called the Rh factor, and we'll talk about that, or antigen C, I think, or D or something like that. Anyways, so the idea is that if our immune system sees A, but A isn't my kind of blood, my immune system's going to attack it and kill it. And that's bad, because if my red blood cells die, then what's going to happen to me?
I'm also gonna die.
I'm also going to die. That's exactly right. So this whole process has to work in a certain way to make sure that you don't kill your